most distinguished achievement, friend of Kendra. She is a lot of fun to work with. Welcome to all of you. Let's get to Lilith, because I'm sure you've all heard lots of funny things about Lilith. And what I would like to do with you, with the aid of an extraordinarily beautiful PowerPoint, which Kendra has made for us, is to give you the background of who Lilith was, first to remind you she never really existed, and to really clarify for you, can you all hear me? I think my voice is pretty resonant. What the sources, the original Jewish sources, say about Lilith. Why are we doing this, by the way, when we are the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies? Because the vast majority of sources about Lilith come from Spanish Jewish sources from the 8th century, which would be the beginning, close to the beginning of the Middle Ages, through to the end of the 16th. Of course, this is after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And Kendra used a word she's now very familiar with, maybe not everybody else does, a Sephardic Jew. What is a Sephardic Jew? One of them is standing in front of you. Sepharad is the word in Hebrew for Spain. And so Sephardic Jews trace their ancestry in a general sense back to Spain, North Africa, or including certain Jewish communities in Asia, which follow what we call Hatekes Asfaradi in Hebrew, the Spanish Rite. There's a very strong connection to Spain. Later on, as we'll see, that also spills over into Latin America, because that will be where many Sephardic, now you know that word, Spanish Jewish, refugees will go, even though there's an Inquisition in Latin America placed by Spain, but Latin America was big, so you could hide. Lilith. Okay, the first thing I would like you all to do is to please put out of your mind everything you've heard about her from popular culture. You have heard possibly she was a demoness. Not quite. See, that child is crying because she knows that Lilith was never a demoness. You may have heard she was a vampire. Well, in certain of these Sephardic Jewish sources, she is. But if you've heard she's linked with Satan and the devil, let me explain something to you that you should have clear from the beginning of this presentation. In Jewish tradition, there is no hell. And in Jewish tradition, the character that we call Satan, who no, you do not want to have a coffee with, he's a bit prickly, but he is the angel of death, and, you know, he's got a harsh boss. But it is not a character that opposes God's will. So what you should have to have in your mind is that Lilith is not some cosmic rebel who defies God. We're going to see that this very complicated creature, this literary invention, because I repeat, she does not exist, is somebody who actually is meant to serve God in a rather strange way. How many of you have heard that she's connected with sex? Yes, of course, that's where we're all here. So she is. And also to understand what this means in the tradition you're about to hear, in Jewish tradition, we do not have the idea of original sin. So sex is not a sin. The sin was hanging out with the serpent. Hanging out with the serpent. You can see I was born in Spanish Harlem. I was brought up later in Argentina. My family are Argentine Jews, but I was born in Spanish Harlem. So we talk about hanguear in Spanish. When you hang out with the serpent, the sin was disobeying God and differentiating between good and evil. Sex itself is not the sin. And I say that because the story of Lilith is one that involves a great deal of sensuality. And if you look at the sensuality as being sinful, you're getting it wrong. So with these two facts established, that Satan in Jewish tradition is the angel of death. We do not have a devil. In Jewish folklore, we've got a bunch of kind of lesser sprites we call shadim, which are, if you know the word from Elizabethan English, shades. Okay, sort of spirits you probably don't want to see walking around changing hands, but also subservient to God's will. So Lilith is subservient to God's will, however freaky she appears to be. Lilith, she-devil in the Garden of Eden. She is she-devil. She's often referred to that way in popular culture. We're going to see that she wasn't, but she certainly has her place in the Garden of Eden. Why do you see an owl there? Why do you see an image that is, dare I say it, a pretty obvious male fantasy? Correct? And I just put that in here, well, Kendra actually was the one who found this wonderful image, because Lilith herself is not meant to be a feminist statement. Now, I say that, you might be surprised because you've heard of the Lilith magazine, maybe? The Lilith Music Fair? Please understand that the writings in which Lilith appeared in the 13th century in Spain, in the great work of Spanish Jewish mysticism called the Cabalah. Are you familiar with that word? How many of you have heard Madonna studies the Cabalah? Madonna kind of studies a fairly watered-down version of the Cabalah. Oh, Madonna as Lilith, that's something to think about. Right? Yes, that's the modern-day reincarnation. But in Sephardic Jewish tradition, traditionally, women were not supposed to read the Cabalah. So this was not a feminist tract given to women saying this is how you should act. And that's a very important point. Now, why the owl, you know? So, while Kendra and I were spending actually a tremendously fun afternoon putting this together for you, Kendra asked me at one point, she told me what she had known of Lilith, and you asked me if Lilith was actually mentioned in the Bible. So she is mentioned in the Bible once. When I say the Bible, I'm being kind of culturally biased, I'm referring to the Old Testament. So she's mentioned in the Jewish Bible once. She is never mentioned in the New Testament. The one time she's mentioned in the Tanakh, as we say, the Jewish Bible, it's in the book of Isaiah. And the quote is 34:14. And she is mentioned as an owl, or an owl is mentioned. That's the only time the word Lilith appears in the Bible. That's it. And she is mentioned when the prophet Isaiah is talking about the terrible destruction of Jerusalem by the Assyrian armies, and he creates this image of a city laid waste. Well, the city was doing pretty badly under the Assyrian armies. The Jews had been exiled, some taken into captivity. How many of you have heard of the phrase the 10 lost tribes? That's around the time they got lost. And what Isaiah says is that the city sits desolate and only Lilith, and that word gets translated later as owl, sits among the rooms. Okay, so the great Israeli linguist, Yehuda Al-Kalai, looks at this and says, the word in Hebrew for owl is yanshuf. Was it ever Lilith? And he researched this, and he couldn't find any evidence that the word for owl was ever Lilith, which actually makes one think that maybe Isaiah was talking about Lilith herself, if that's Lilith. God knows what Lilith looked like. Because she never existed. What did she look like? She looked like nothing. Was that Lilith sitting among the rooms? Notice the snake. That's not just any snake. That's the snake. That one. From the Garden of Eden. Why there? Why is Lilith connected with the owl? Now you understand that. Why is she connected with the snake? Many later artists, including, we were talking about this today with Kendra when I said, should I mention Michelangelo? I just mentioned him now. Many later artists, including Michelangelo, personified the serpent as a woman. And in the 15th and 16th century, there was a tradition that was fairly widespread among both the Spanish Jews of Italy. How'd the Spanish Jews get to Italy? Remember, they kicked out of Spain in 1492? And the Pope takes them in. Something to remember, because the Jews were kicked out of Spain by a supposedly Catholic regime. That was never the will of the Pope. So the Pope welcomes the Jews into Italy. That's actually where my family comes from, okay? The Sephardic Jews from Italy, later going to Argentina. And so you have the mythology of Lilith coming to Italy, and both Jews and Christians looking at Michelangelo's painting, particularly this one in the Sistine Chapel, in which the serpent is personified as a very buxom woman, tended to identify her as Lilith. So that's the only biblical reference to her. Or maybe there's another. So let's see. Okay, she goes back much earlier. Except I don't know if that's actually Lilith. What you just saw is much more the Lilith, both of the Sephardic Jewish texts and the popular mind. Looking into the origin of Lilith, the great German Jewish scholar Sigmund Hurwitz, whose book sold out, but we'll reorder it for those of you who want it. Sigmund Hurwitz found images of Lilith, if this was indeed Lilith, going back to the time that the Jews were exiled and taken to Babylon. Because in Babylonian epics, there is a mention of a demon that is both male and female. I want you to remember that because when we get into Genesis and the story of creation, the male-female doubleness is going to come back, and you'll see, ooh, that's how they inserted Lilith into the Bible, when she's not actually mentioned in Genesis, just in Isaiah. But this demon, both quote-unquote male and female, and is, please notice, also human and bird, right? You see the owl feet, you see the wings. Okay, so this idea of the bird person is very prevalent in ancient cultures, from ancient Peru in the Andes to ancient Babylon. That character is called Lilitu. That's Lilitu. That's found on images in Babylon, what's left of Iraq. From that period, the period of Nebuchadnezzar, you have the dates there, 587 to 537. Those are the first visual images of Lilith and Lilitu. There's a possibility she was mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, because there's another rather odd female character inside the Tree of Life. That's another universal concept. That character is mentioned as Lilikahe. Now you're hearing the Lily, and so, you know, the temptation is to say, oh, every time I hear Lil, it's Lilith. I would remind you, as the Israeli linguist that I mentioned to you, Yehuda Alkalai, says, you have to watch out for false cognates in language. Not all words that have similar sounding syllables mean the same thing. But yes, it's provocative. Now how does this get from Babylon into Jewish tradition? And then later specifically into Spanish Jewish tradition. Because the Jews were in Babylon for a heck of a long time. And in fact, when the Jews were allowed back from Babylon to Jerusalem, what did most of us do? Did we go running back? Nope. 9/10 of the Jewish people stayed in Babylon. 1/10 goes back to Jerusalem. Which means, culturally, a lot of Babylonian mythology is going to penetrate Jewish tradition. Was she in Eden? My dear, what happens with this woman? Well, let's make this very easy to understand, because great texts are easy to understand. And the Jewish thinker Maimonides says in the Guide to the Perplexed, if you can't explain what you mean to a 5-year-old, you don't know what you're saying. Something to remind many university professors. And I'm an academic too. Go back to the first book of Genesis, and of course you have God creating man. The word used in Hebrew is Adam, and I'm going to throw a lot of Hebrew at you because the English translation, the King James translation, God bless it, is not always, or in Spanish, the translation by Moises Aragel, is not always that faithful to the Hebrew. So Adam could be Adam, you know, that's where you get the word Adam from, the first man. That is indeed what he is called in the book of Genesis. Or it could be a generic term. Adam also comes from the Hebrew Adamah, the earth. Adam is the earth. Chava, that's Eve, that's the wife you know, because it turns out he had a first wife. Maybe. Her name, as Alkalai pointed out, comes from the root for air. So the marriage of Adam and Eve you could look at as the union of earth and air, right? The elements. But at the end of the first chapter of Genesis, God has created male and female together and blessed them. And you don't have the name of that woman. And then you know you go into Genesis 2, and Adam is suddenly alone and cries out to God, you know, because it is not good for a man to be alone, the book of Genesis tells us, and God creates Eve from Adam's rib. You know that story. Well, what happened to that woman who was created on the sixth day? Was that Eve? If it was Eve, why isn't she mentioned, and why is Adam suddenly alone? That inconsistency attracted scholars and writers throughout many centuries. Who was that first woman? Because that first woman was not created from Adam's rib. That first woman is equal, kind of, with Adam. At the point when, I think this is interesting for both Jews and Christians to understand the chronology of our respective Bibles, because, you know, if I ask you, how many people are Jewish, how many people are Christian, everybody will raise their hand. How many people have actually read the Bibles? Okay. Better, excellent question as well. So if we actually read the books we say we consider so holy, what we're going to find is that at one point they diverge when Christianity begins with the New Testament. Around the what we now call the first century, Judaism continues with another long commentary in two parts called the Mishnah and the Gemara. We'll call them the Talmud. Have you ever heard the word the Talmud? Lilith is mentioned there. And she is described, and if you're looking for the quote, and I'll just throw this out to those who are interested, the quote is Nida 24b. She's described as a woman's face, as having a woman's face with long hair and wings. She's not described as a woman. Isn't that interesting? She has a woman's face, long hair and wings. She's not yet described as a woman. Ooh, but there she looks pretty female, doesn't she? That's a very famous image of Lilith from a later time. That's Rossetti's painting of her. And you notice she has red hair, and I point that out to you because in Sephardic Jewish tradition, we say that if you're looking for the children of Lilith among humanity, because guess what, her children get into humanity too, you can always tell them by one of three characteristics, that they've got all three. Ooh, you're there. Being left-handed, having green eyes, or red hair. If you combine more than one of those, you are there, which of course led an Irish friend of mine to say so was the entire country of children of Lilith, because there were a lot of red hair and green eyes. Those traits were considered very much the sign of Lilith. So what happens to her? Why does she disappear? To understand that, we have to go into a book that was written in the 8th century, which is called the Alphabet of Ben Sira. The book was written in southern Spain in the area called Catalonia. Lilith is presented there as Adam's sexual equal. And Adam does not like that, and so he divorces Lilith, and the term that he uses in Hebrew, the book is written, by the way, it's only in 8 pages, so it's a small little booklet. The term that he uses in Hebrew is gerush. That term can be used to mean either divorce or exile. I want you to remember that when we talk about the Jews exiled from Spain, and the way this legend is going to come up even more during the exile. She does not want to be subservient to Adam. There's a segment in the Alphabet of Ben Sira where she says specifically, I will not accept the subservient position. 3 angels come to find Lilith. She's been exiled to the Red Sea. And they say, come back, Adam wants you back. And she says, no. And then one of the angels says to her, every day that you do not return to Adam, you will lose, listen closely, 100 of your children. And her response is, if you kill 100 of my children, I will kill 100 of Adam's children. Now you have to know that in Hebrew, the term for humanity is Bnei Adam, meaning literally the sons of Adam. And then we have the sprites and the spirits, and they are called Bnei Lilith, meaning the sons of Lilith. Look at the way one gets the matronymic and one gets the patronymic. Okay, so Lilith predominates. In the other world, which we call in Aramaic, Sitra Achara. Now that has been mistranslated as hell so many times into English, or infierno so many times into Spanish. It makes me furious. It does not mean hell, it means the other realm. You want to compare it to something? Are you familiar with, I love this type of folklore, Celtic folklore? When the term fairyland is spoken about, that's not hell. Lilith is the queen of the other world. She becomes queen after her first marriage to Adam ends in divorce or expulsion. Now let's look at where the story begins to get crazy. And that's in the 13th century. In the 13th century, the most important work of Jewish mysticism is published, and that is called the ZOHAR. It's published in the city of León in Spain. The author is the Rabbi Moises de León. I'll take questions at the end. The author is Rabbi Moises de León. He claimed to have received the book from the spirit of an earlier rabbi named Shimon Bar Yochai. That was a common method in the Middle Ages. Both Jews and Christians used it to legitimate what you were writing, claim that you'd received it from an earlier source. Linguists who've gone over the Zohar have discounted that. The Zohar was written in a type of Aramaic that is so influenced by 13th century Spanish. It's obvious that Moises de León wrote that book. He is the one who turns Lilith into the central figure. She becomes ever after in both Kabbalistic studies and popular culture. And he takes that short story of Lilith that existed in that earlier little pamphlet, The Alphabet of Ben Sirah, and she becomes the central character of the Zohar. Zohar in Hebrew means the brilliance, the shining. So what happens now? Now we can talk about the legend of Lilith. In the Zohar, Lilith is that first woman, the woman created on the sixth day. She does not want the position Adam has given her, neither the sexual one nor the philosophical one. She will not be beneath him. When Adam threatens to expel her from the Garden of Eden in the Zohar, her reaction is pretty militant. She says, expel me, I will go with Samael. Who's Samael? Well, he's a hunk. Yeah, that's the way he's described in the Zohar. He's described as someone like Lilith, created by God. Again, he is not the devil. There is no devil in this tradition. He is described as Lilith's height. She is supposed to be very tall. She is supposed to have a very pale face, so does he. She has violet eyes, probably reminding some of you who remember her of Elizabeth Taylor. He has green eyes and red hair. And he is Lilith's substitute for Adam. And she says, if you expel me, I will procreate with Samael. So Adam arrogantly expels her, thinking she'll come running back. She doesn't. And then she starts to get her revenge. She starts to kill human children. Well, now understand this in terms of history. You needed an explanation for infant death. When Jews and Christians and Muslims all claim we all believe everything comes from God and everything is God's will, kind of hard to attribute that to the Almighty, right? So it helps to have somebody like Lilith to pin the blame on. How do you protect yourself from Lilith? Amulets. Some of you may have seen these Sephardic Jewish amulets without knowing what they are. A 5-fingered hand, where one of the fingers is slightly deformed. We call it the Khamsa. That's also very common in Islam. Black eyeliner, called kohel in Middle Eastern tradition, keeps her away. A red string around your wrist keeps her away. Red, the color of blood. Anything of the color blue. So some of you are protected against Lilith, and some of you are inviting her in tonight. She's the home wrecker. Or is she a divine nanny? Because we're going to see that later legends actually will humanize her and give her another function. But in the Zohar, she's not humanized. In the Zohar, she has an ugly function, yet it is a function given by God. Because Adam did her wrong. And Eve was a bit of a milquetoast. So you have to understand the system of thought that Lilith comes from. It is a mystical system. Judaism has its rationalist systems and its mystical ones. I don't believe in the Cabalah. I, like another Jewish thinker by the name of Maimonides, I just mentioned to you, is quite rationalistic. The Cabalah I find to be a wonderful work of literature. I'm giving you my point of view because everyone has a point of view. It doesn't have to be yours. But I want you to understand where I am coming from and how I'm analyzing it. Because if I believed in Lilith, I would not be talking about her, nor reading about her, nor teaching about her, because I'm a woman. And in Kabbalistic tradition, I'm not supposed to do that. The idea of, do you remember I mentioned in the older Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, a character who might have been a forebearer of Lilith, Lilikahe, coming from a world tree? This idea of a world tree, we call it in Hebrew, Eitz Chaim. It is in Norse mythology, it is the Yggdrasil, something Kendra took up for me, and thank you, Kendra, for reminding me of it, because this is a very universal tradition. The Mayan Indians have it as well, and it is in also early Chinese thought. The universe has a tree, and each of these trees has a divine emanation. I'm not going to go through all of the divine emanations in Hebrew with you, but I will tell you which one Lilith is supposed to come from. And it's the 9th one. This one. Yesod, which means foundation, and it is associated in Kabbalistic thought with the sexual urge. It's that part of the body. And Lilith is innately sexual. Well, she flies from Judaism to Christianity and Islam. Because this story of this unruly female attracts male thinkers of all three religions who still don't want it getting out to women. Okay, so please remember, from the 13th through the 15th century, and I cannot emphasize this point enough, the only people reading the Lilith stories were men. Okay? Whether we are in the rabbinical academies of Cordoba in southern Spain, whether we are in the Christian academies of Barcelona, and you're being taught by Raymond Lull, or whether you are in the Muslim madrasot of Andalusia, of southern Spain. It's only men reading about this. It is forbidden to women. In Islamic tradition, she becomes associated with the Queen of Sheba. And there's a whole interesting kind of conflation, that's a really pretentious academic word, I love that word. Conflation just means a blending, or can I give you a better word, a squishing together of traditions, it's conflation. And she is conflated with the Queen of Sheba, who, like Lilith, is suddenly described as having owl feet. Do you see how this goes back to an older tradition? She will come into 19th century literature. Let's read that, the great poet Robert Browning. Adam, Lilith, and Eve one day it thundered and lightened, two women fairly frightened, who also don't look like they really lack a man there. So, thank you, Kendra. She finds the most amazing pictures. And you illustrated it, my dear. Sank to their knees, transformed, transfixed at the feet of the man who sat betwixt. In mercy cried each, if I tell the truth of a passage in my youth. What passage is Robert Browning referring to there? And then he goes back to the first book of Genesis. The last line in this longer poem states that the paradise door was closed to Lilith, which seems to insinuate to us that Robert Browning would have been influenced by the stories of Lilith in the ZOHAR. But now we have to go back and see what happens to Lilith after the 13th and 14th and 15th century, once the Jews lose Sepharad, Spain, and are sent into exile. It was one of the greatest moments of crisis in the Jewish world. And Lilith at this point, during the exile, is going to undergo a transformation. Just checking the time. Yes, good. We are on time. Lilith will not let us be late. When Kendra found this image, I found it particularly interesting for two reasons. Because it is sympathetic, definitely is. It is beautiful, it retains the seductive image, and it is also sympathetic. So what happens? Why does Lilith, the child killeress, the one who is going to take revenge on Adam, because he would not let her have an equal role in Eden, How does she suddenly become this beautiful woman who cries for the Jews sent out of Spain from the exile? Well, this has to do with when women begin to get a hold of the stories. So, and if you want more information on this, again, that wonderful book that sold out, which being again reorder for those of you who want it, Sigmund Hurwitz's book Lilith the First Eve, will explain this to you. Another very great German Jewish scholar, Gershom Scholem, in another book will explain it to you. Once the Jews were expelled from Spain, the rabbinical academies ended. They were destroyed by the Inquisition. Closed by the Inquisition and then destroyed. That means a lot of male control over canonical knowledge is either going to be lost, or as Gershom Scholem points out, transmitted to women in an oral sense. So the stories women had not read about Lilith in the Zohar, they're not going to hear. But they're going to give a very different twist to these stories. Now, remember I mentioned to you that that word for Lilith as the first divorced female, gerush, grusha in her case because she's a woman, the same word is applied in Jewish texts from the Talmudic period on to mean divorce or exile. Once you're exiled, you can kind of sympathize with her, right? We lost our Garden of Eden in Spain. She lost her Garden of Eden. A new twist is taken on these stories. She's no longer portrayed as a vampiress, which she is in the Zohar, and I'm going to spare you some of the more colorful descriptions of how she uses her vampirical qualities to seduce men and take them down to her underwater kingdom, where they will remain her slaves till the Messiah comes. Remember, in Jewish tradition, we are still waiting. So, you know, there are very graphic, sensual descriptions of her. Once we get into 1492, the year not only that America was discovered and colonized by Spain, but the year that the Jews were expelled from Spain, that same year, Lilith suddenly becomes a very sympathetic character, and although she is portrayed still as a vampiress, she's only a vampiress for justice. Vampiresses for justice. So, in the most famous story about Lilith from the exile period for Sephardic Jews goes from 1492 till 1834. That's the year that the Inquisition was finally abolished. You realize it lasted that long? Some of you just think it's 1492. 1832. Long time. The most famous story from that time is called The Kiss, and it speaks of how Lilith meets a human man. Okay, now a lot of time has gone by. Lilith has been living with Samael. They have a wonderful marriage. Yes, they marry, and she's considered to be a virtuous woman. She's even considered to be a religious Jewish woman. She lights the candles on Friday night. She's, you know. And then Samael dies, and she's alone, and she meets a human man. And her father, who in some of the stories is her husband, but in this particular story is her father, Ashmedai, the king of the shades, says to her, it's a wonderful quote, "Lilith, do not fall in love with a human man. They are all liars and cheats." She doesn't listen to him. And she falls in love with this human man, who of course has been lost and shipwrecked and been pulled down to the bottom of the sea, which is where Lilith is. Well, she is. And he, of course, has a wife on land, whom he left in the city of Jaffa. It's a very pretty port city in modern-day Israel. And because Jaffa was a place where people always went to sea, you met explorers, pirates, and then there was no internet, there was no television, so you talked. And that's why a lot of these stories about Lilith come from Jaffa. And so Lilith does not know about his wife. They marry and have a child. He's a bigamist now. Or is he? Did you know that in Sephardic Jewish tradition, men continued to have more than one wife? Wait until the 14th century. The story's from the 16th. So he's a bigamist. Polygamy was abolished by the German Jews in the 10th century. Sephardic Jews, we waited longer, 400 years longer. Finally, machismo was abolished in Spain in the 14th century. By the 16th century, it only exists in the country of Yemen. That was the country where polygamy held on the longest. So he's a bigamist, and after a year he tells Lilith, I've got to go back and see my wife. And Lilith is so understanding, she says to him, I'll let you go back for a year on the condition that you come back to me. And her father, Ashmedai, the king of the shades, says to her again, Lilith, you cannot trust a human man. Stay with supernatural shade men. They are better for you. And Lilith, no, I want a human man. So she lets him go back. By the way, we never know his name, but we do know the name of the son they had, because that's going to be B'nai Lilith. That's going to be one of the sons of Lilith. His name is Solomon. That freaks you out? Yeah. It should. It should. Okay. So he goes back to his human wife in Jaffa, and he's quite happy, and Lilith is heartbroken after a year. One of the shades, one of the sprites, comes to her and says, Lilith, he's not coming back to you. And Ashmedai says, I told you so. You leave those human men alone. And she takes her child, Solomon, and says to her father, Ashmedai, I'm going to ascend up to the earth. I'm going to Jaffa. I have to make an edut. Edut in Hebrew is a testimony. It's a public testimony. You're going to see that everything Lilith does in this story now is firmly within classical Jewish tradition. She goes to, there she is again, being transformed. Now her role becomes a good one. She goes to the community where he is. Notice the second bullet point. She receives divine sanction for what she is going to do. She is going to kill him with God's agreement. So she calls the people of Jaffa together for this edut, for this public testimony, and says, he is an adulterer, he is a liar, he abandoned me. She turns to his wife and she says, I'm not going to harm you. You had nothing in this business. I have nothing against you. I'm going to give you my son Solomon. And he'll grow up and become a great king. One hell of a background for King Solomon. Yeah? Because the story, of course, although it's from the 16th century, it is set in a kind of no time. And again, I'm going to ask you to read Irish fairy tales, because Irish fairy tales also have this idea of a kind of timeless time. It's just other time. Okay? And now he starts feeling a little bit, guilty, and he says, Lilith, can I just have one more kiss from you? It's the moment she's waiting for. And she kisses him. By the way, this story was first written down in Judeo-Spanish, something called Ladino, which is basically the Spanish that was spoken in the late 15th century when the Jews were expelled from Spain. She says, sure, dear. And she kisses him, and the word in Spanish that's used is ahogar, which anybody who speaks Spanish knows that's to drown. She drowns him in her kiss. She kills him. And she leaves his body on the floor. And interestingly enough, that person's first wife then goes to Lilith and embraces her, which means that guy was no the husband. So you have the two women coming together again. So that's also quite interesting. And she leaves the earthly wife Solomon and says, raise him to be a great king. And he builds the temple. Look at that origin that is attributed to King Solomon. Notice that last bullet point. Lilith determines the sincerity of intention of the Cabalah, because in the period of the expulsion, being Sephardic Jewish, I focus a lot on Spain, but in Germany, which was Germany and Poland, which were the other two centers of Jewish life, that was a very bad period for Jews as well. And the legends travel north. We even have a kind of insinuation of Lilith as the serpent in an interesting Anglo-Saxon chronicle called Genesis B, where the serpent actually says, you know, I'm only doing God's bidding, which also kind of makes you think maybe that's Lilith. Because you see, Lilith is given, as the great German Jewish intellectual Gershom Scholem points out, she's given another function. She is the one who has to determine whether a rabbi is virtuous enough to bring the Messiah. Remember, in Jewish tradition, we're still waiting for the Messiah. To bring the Messiah, you have to, in Kabbalistic tradition, this is not canonical Jewish tradition, this is Kabbalistic Jewish tradition, you have to be able to withstand Lilith's charms. Well, we're still waiting for the Messiah. There is an insinuation of the Lilith stories in the beautiful old German folktales of the Lorelei. Lovely women who sit and sing by the river, and we have this connection between the supernatural woman by the river. Lilith lives under the sea, supposedly under the Red Sea. A very, very famous, one of the most famous poets of Germany was a German Jew, Heinrich Heine, wrote the poem The Lorelei. He did not invent that legend, that's a legend from German folklore, but in that poem he interweaves elements from the Lilith legend. So she enters popular culture before she appears as the character on Cheers. Which is, I know where a lot of you heard of her first. In Mexico and in Peru, when Jews flee illegally to Mexico and Peru, which of course have been colonized by Spain, and Spain at that period was not allowing any freedom of religion, clandestine Sephardic Jewish refugees bring these stories to Mexico and Peru and Central America, and they connect with Native American traditions. And we have the character of the mulata de Córdoba, who's supposed to be a beautiful mulata, light-skinned black woman, who seduces men to prove they are not virtuous, and flies away when she is sentenced to death by the Inquisition. The first time that story appears in Mexico, it's with a family by the last name of Carvajal, who are probably the most famous secret, we say, crypto-Judeo, secret Jewish family to flee to the New World. And in South America, because remember Mexico is North America. How many of you know that? You get a point for me if you know. It's Latin America, but it's North America. Don't call a Mexican a South American. South America is below Central America. There we get, that was your geography sermon for the day, there we get actually an image of Lilith which seems to go back to the older stories of the ZOHAR, and she's called the Llorona. She becomes a mix of the Malinche from Mexico, beautiful Aztec woman betrayed by Cortez, so some of North America comes down to South America. Other beautiful Inca women betrayed by Spanish conquistadors, and Lilith herself. And she walks through Peru and Chile crying for her children, right? She's always crying, ¿Dónde están mis hijos? Where are my children? And she carries in her arms the dead child. And this is actually very interesting because this story has both Native American, Mestizo, and Sephardic Jewish roots. And she's a very feared character, the Llorona. You don't want to run into her late at night. You run into her in the same place you run into Lilith, if you're looking for them. A crossroads at midnight. Once again, I mentioned the Irish. Anybody who knows Irish folklore knows what that means. The crossroads is where the two worlds, human and fairy, communicate. And midnight is, of course, that crossing hour. So we see she's now come to the New World when the Inquisition is finally abolished by the Latin American patriots in the 19th century. This folklore comes out of the woodwork. And because it blends so well with Native American and Mestizo, Latin American folklore, it becomes quite popular. And it will go from there into English. Lilith comes into English via German from Heinrich Heine, when Heine is translated into English, and from Spanish from Latin America. That's how you know of Lilith. And that's how that executive at NBC decided to put her into Cheers. The children of Lilith. Well, you know the red hair, and you know the green eyes, and you know the left-handedness. So Paul McCartney is a child of Lilith, right? Plays left-handed bass. Why those Why those characteristics? Well, look at the Latin word for left, sinistra. Right? You have your word sinister in English from this. Being left-handed was considered odd by many cultures because most people are not. So it was always looked at a bit strangely. Red hair is a recessive trait. Rather odd when it appears. In Hebrew, we call a person with red hair gingy, and there are all sorts of funny beliefs connected with somebody, and that's Lilith on the phone for us right now, who has red hair. And the green eyes, well, that actually, I think, is a reference from the Zohar, because when Samael, her male consort, is described, the issue of his green eyes and the way he hexes women with green eyes is very strong. So, if you have all three characteristics, then you are 75% child of Lilith, 25% child of Adam. If you only have one of them, or two of them, so you can calculate that yourself when you do your DNA. And Lilith's great purpose from the 16th century on has been as she always was a servant of God. You see, in Jewish tradition, she never rebels. God supports her, as we want you to support us. Isn't that good? I'm proud of myself for that one. Wasn't that good? That was good. Even Ken was good. Ken's approval. Proof that I go through the PowerPoints before I just start talking. But before we get to this not so spiritual side, let's talk about, again, her final purpose. Because there are many wild sexual legends of Lilith, but in all of her wildness, she always does the bidding of God. And I just want to close with one of them, which is the story of Lilith and the Rabbi Jose, because remember, we're Spanish Jews, Jose de la Reina, which of course means Joseph of the King. Rabbi Jose de la Reina, back in the 16th century, in the city of Tzfat, which is a very beautiful city in northern Israel, very impregnated with mysticism, decides, that's it, I'm bringing the Messiah. Can't take this anymore. Expulsions, disasters, let's bring the Messiah. So he decides he's going to bring the Messiah, and God says to Lilith, start moving, dear. Go seduce him. And Lilith says to God, because remember, by this time it's also women now telling the stories. And interestingly enough, you have a bunch of stories written, okay, a bunch of, give me 3 more minutes, stories written anonymously at this point, published in Tzfat, okay, the city in northern Israel. Of course, that whole area was under the Ottoman mandate at that point. Italy, where many of the Jews have found refuge, and illegally in the city of Mexico. This was really illegal because the Inquisition was beating away in the late 16th century. So these stories may have been published by women. And in this story of Rabbi Jose de la Reina, Lilith says to God, you are destroying my shlom bayit in Hebrew, the peace I have in my home, my domestic bliss. Leave me alone. I have a good relationship with Samael. Let me enjoy it. No, God says to her, got a job to do, right? The dilemma of the working woman. So, because Lilith, remember, does not rebel. So Lilith says to Samael, come with me. Okay, this is interesting because, you know, if you view her as a seducer, she seems to be rather amoral. She's not amoral. She's in love with Samael. And when she seduces men to prove their virtue, that's her 9-to-5 job. That's it. So she says to Samael, come with me. We're going to play a trick on Rabbi Jose de la Reina. We're going to prove to him it's not yet time to bring the Messiah. Because you see, God is very angry. He doesn't want the Messiah brought yet. God will decide when the Messiah is to come. So Lilith, on Shabbat, of course, the Jewish holy day, right, beginning on Friday night, ending on Saturday night, because all our holy days begin with 3 stars in the sky, and end that following evening. Lilith appears on Saturday night, which is when we have a ceremony called Havdalah, to differentiate Shabbat from the rest of the week. And Rabbi Jose de la Reina is holding a spice box, which is part of our ceremony. And Lilith comes to him looking as beautiful as she can and says, let me just smell some of the spices. I'm dying of hunger. I'm going to die right before you, but let me have a whiff of your beautiful spices first. And of course, Jose de la Reina loses all control. She's extraordinarily beautiful. She's extraordinarily seductive. And he says to God, let me make a deal with her. I won't give her anything to eat, but I'll let her smell something. And according to the story, God does not answer. No, God doesn't answer because he's waiting for Jose de la Reina to sin. And he does. And he gives Lilith the box of spices, and then we have a description which might strike you more as a conventional hell from Christian literature. Fire darts out of her eyes, her claws come out, and Samael helps her to bind and gag Jose de la Reina, and then the voice of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as we say in Hebrew, the Holy One, blessed be He, comes down from the heavens and says, Joselito, you know, Jose, watch it. Zelo hazman. What's that mean in Hebrew? It's not the time. You do not determine the time of the coming of the Messiah. So Lilith is a good employee. And if you read the academic sources, if you read Gershom Scholem, which is a wonderful introduction to Lilith, if you read Sigmund Hurwitz, who we hope you can read when we reorder the books, go to Pina and say, order me 25 books, because they're really good books. You will understand that she is not a she-devil. And we put that in the title, I got you to come, so she is faithful to God. She is a servant of God with an unhappy job. And a very great Irish writer by the name of James Joyce, when he read the Lilith legend, said, ooh, do we have Lilith in Ireland with the Banshee? With the, the beautiful woman, the woman of the fairy, the Banshee in Gaelic, in Irish Gaelic, the one who sits by the river and weeps for the dead? Well, there may or may not be a connection. There are a lot of Cohans and Levies in Ireland, so I don't know, we can investigate that. But this idea of the woman connected with death but weeping for the dead, not evil, kind of more like the Mexican idea of La Parca, the merciful death who comes for you and does you a favor. Lilith is that. Lilith has a difficult job. She does not rebel against God's will. She serves it. And she does not exist. Please remember that. Because it's awfully easy to start personalizing this person who supports God as we wish you would support us. So now, let me just jump from the spirit world into the material world before I take your questions. And I want to point out to you that sadly, we've gotten a lot of our funds cut. So the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies wants to keep these programs, as Kendra said to me one day, keep them free for you, because they're not free for us. So we would love it. You don't have to jump up and, you know, go to a plate. We're not going to pass a plate around here. But I so would like it, and if you don't do it, I'll send Lilith after you, even if she doesn't exist. Do you see that site up there? Please go to our website, acmrs.org/friends, and see how you can give. If you can give $1, that's fine. If you can give $100, even better. Do please give something so these programs can continue to come to you. Okay, I really must say that, because we've gotten slashed, and we want to keep on bringing these wonderful programs to you. Before I take your questions, I also want to point out another wonderful program you're having with me. That's egotistical sin. On November, oh dear, April 30th, Kendra? Sorry, November. On April 30th, we are having another program here at Changing Hands. It will be a workshop on Nostradamus and an analysis of what were or were not his prophecies. And I'm also going to be tying that in with the Cabalah, because he's another Sephardic Jew in the 16th century. So we're going to take a look and see what the influence of the Cabalah and of prophecy was on this person who was or was not a prophet. So you have to come to the workshop to see that. Look at the website on Changing Hands. They can register, Pina, that way, I believe. Or at the counter here. You can register for that as well. So definitely think of that. We also have a book signing coming up on May 7th correct, for a wonderful retelling of the King Arthur legend called Caliburn. And we have some examples of that back there. Please do take a look at it. ACMRS, the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, has a wonderful historical fiction imprint which Kendra founded. And we have some examples of the books here. So we will be having a book signing with the author, Virgil Renzulli, on May 7th, here at Changing Hands. And now I'll take your questions. You must have some questions about Lilith, and this wonderful person had a question way back in the 13th century when the ZOHAR was passed. Let's start with you.
Do the sources ask if